undergrad and MPP alike. So it's fun to see you here from really all around our country. It's very exciting for us to have Irma with us today and some board members, faculty, staff. We're really thrilled that everyone's joining us. Before I introduce our speaker, I just want to start by recognizing that today is June 19th or Juneteenth, a day that just a couple of days ago, the governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia, Governor Northam, declared as a holiday in Virginia, sentiment that was followed by UVA's president, Jim Ryan. Commemorating the end of slavery in the United States, today is indeed a really important day for reflection, and thus I think it is all the more meaningful today that we're joined by a Batten graduate who will be sharing with us practical tools, particularly policy tools, that we can use to be effective advocates for social change. Herself a tireless public servant, Irma Palmer has more than a decade of experience working at the intersection of policy, politics, and communications, currently serving as U.S. Senator Kamala Harris's speechwriter. In her previous work in the public sector, Irma was the Director of Constituent Services and the Traveling Press Secretary for former Governor of Virginia, Terry McAuliffe. Prior to her work in the governor's office, Irma worked as U.S. Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid's press assistant and U.S. Senator Mary Landrieu's Deputy Press Secretary and Press Secretary of the U.S. Senate Committee on Small Business and Entrepreneurship. While in the private sector, she was a director at a public relations firm in D.C. Irma is as I said, tireless public servant, and her passion for public service began way back when she was in high school, interning with Congressman John Spratt from South Carolina. She returned to Capitol Hill annually throughout college and interned for numerous members of Congress, and also volunteered in President Barack Obama's Office of Presidential Correspondence, and was a graduate fellow of the Democratic Party of Virginia. Irma is a double who. She graduated from the University of Virginia with a Bachelor of Arts in English, and then her Master of Public Policy from the Batten School. She's also a graduate of the Sorensen Institute Political Leaders Program. And if she finds time in her schedule, I'm not sure how she does, but she also serves on the Batten School's advisory board. She's a mentor to students. She is an active contributor. We are thrilled. She is so busy, and we are just absolutely thrilled that you would join us today, Irma, and can't wait to hear what you have to share. She's going to offer her remarks first, and then we'll open it up to questions. We're going to use the chat feature, given that we have so many participants. So feel free to start asking your questions in the chat room, and then we will ask her those in turn. So without further ado, virtual round of applause for Irma. Thank you for being with us.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Jill. I also wanted to thank Dean Solomon, as well as my mentor, President Castine. I really am excited to chat with everyone today. I do want to first start off with an acknowledgement that I am here on behalf of myself as an alum in my personal capacity, not on behalf of my office. So before we get into the tools and tips and tricks, I really want to focus on what advocacy is, right? I really think that it's important to realize that you have both to look at what your passion is and what the world's need is, and find the intersection. That is important because it helps drive you through advocacy. It helps sustain you through it. This is a marathon, not a sprint. And so I want to take a little bit of time for folks to really drill into that and think about what that is. So when you say passion, right, what is my passion? It kind of seems like a buzzword. And I think that you really need to focus on what brings you joy. So say, for example, you have a free Saturday and you can do whatever you choose to do, anything that brings you joy. I'll give an example. I enjoy cooking. So if I'm cooking a nutritious meal, I think of the different steps that it takes for me to make that meal, right? I look up a recipe online. I go to the store and get nutritious recipes, understanding what's good to nourish my body. And within that, though, you have to think of how that could possibly not be accessible for other people, right? So you have to think of the fact that some people may not have access to the internet, or the education to read a recipe, or the nutrition education to understand what's healthy, or to have a job with a living wage to buy those nutritious ingredients. So when I say talking about your passion and the world's need, finding issues and things that you can do that really show that intersection, because changing the world, advancing things is very difficult. And if you have that sustainability as the forefront, as the umbrella of things that you do, it really will help. So I just encourage folks to spend a little bit of time really thinking about what drives them and thinking about, again, that intersection between your passion and the world's need. Okay. The other thing I want folks to remember before we get into the tips and tricks here is that you really need to believe in your ability to create change. You know, a lot of people think that changing the world is overwhelming and that it's too big of a problem to even start to chip away at. But you have to remember deep within yourself that you can change things. You have to believe in your vision. You have to believe in that goal and that things can get better. You know, one of the things that my boss says that I really agree with is that you have to see what is possible unburdened by what has been. And really think about that as you go through these tools we're going to discuss. So I want to just first acknowledge that and frame the conversation with that important piece. Okay. I'm going to talk about 4 different kinds of advocacy, and then I'm really going to spend a lot of time talking about the communications part of things and all the different tips and tricks within that bucket. So the first 4, I'm going to talk about your personal influence, grassroots, direct action, and engagement with officials. So the first one I want to talk about is your personal sphere of influence. This is something that you really should not discount. It's a very important part of advocacy and really figuring out what your path forward will be. And what I mean by this is thinking about your friends, your family members, neighbors, coworkers, having conversations with them. Let's talk, for example, about the issue of systemic racism. You know, that issue is bubbling up to our collective awareness. But to be clear, these issues have been happening for generations. You know, today is Juneteenth, as Jill mentioned, something to note. And when you talk about these issues, can they be uncomfortable? Yes. But are they worth having conversations with people about? Absolutely. Don't discount the ability for you to have positive change within your own personal world and sphere of influence. When you have conversations with people, learn about the issue, humanize the problem, and then you're able to look and think about things in different ways and figure out what specifically you can do as an action to make things better. You know, I think about it this way. If every single person did one thing every day to advance justice and equality and fairness, think about how much better holistically as a world we would be. So again, do not discount the importance of having conversations that can be difficult but are worth it. Okay, the other part of advocacy I want to discuss is the grassroots side of things. So what I mean by this are different stakeholder groups, like let's say the National Urban League or the Sierra Club. They have a lot of local chapters, right? Some of them focus on direct service issues, like, for example, handing out food at a food pantry. Some of them focus on more, engaging with elected officials and advocating for either budgetary differences or changes or policies. But there's a lot of work there that folks can help work with. Right now, it's a little bit different with COVID, right? You may not be going in person. You may not be, doing the direct in-person work, but there's so much you can do. As Batten students especially, you have such a good skill set of understanding policy and communicating and writing. I just encourage you to reach out to whatever issue that's important to you, finding a local chapter that's working on the problem and asking them, hey, do you need help analyzing a new policy that's happening or coming up with strategic ideas to advance, a certain strategy? There's so many things that you can do. It's just a matter of picking up the phone, emailing, and figuring out what you specifically can do to help on a grassroots level. The other side of things is the direct action side of things. And what I mean by that are protests, demonstrations, sit-ins. These are really important to do. Again, with COVID, wear a mask, make sure you're taking care of your health. But they are important to do, and they do bring a lot of attention to an issue. The last one that I want to talk about before we get into the communication side of things is direct engagement with elected officials. Now, a lot of people can say they discount like, oh, you know, if I call or I write a letter, it's not going to do much. That is not the case. You really need to remember that you have tools within your own self to be able to make sure that change is heard, that problems are brought to the surface, and that a specific ask is made at the end of you flagging an issue for an elected official, right? Again, like you can do the phone calls, the emails, the letters, but one thing I want to talk about is the importance of collective action within this bucket, right? So if you have a bunch of students within your cohort that are interested about a topic, think about getting everyone on a letter and writing about something and having a specific call to action at the end, something you were asking for, because elected officials, a lot of the times, sometimes they may not be aware of an issue, so you're educating in that way. But a lot of times they are somewhat familiar with the issue, and they're gonna say, okay, great, but what are you asking me to do? So making sure you have a very specific, realistic ask at the end is extremely important. Now, I've mentioned all these 4 buckets before we get into communications, but I want folks to really think about the importance of amplifying all these things through communications, right? So when you write that letter, that group letter, when you write things that, or you call, make sure that you're amplifying it either through earned media, social media, and we'll get into these in a little bit. But the importance is that when you're thinking about action and advocacy, you have to amplify it because it brings more awareness to it and it brings a collective understanding of the issue. Okay, now going into communications. There are really 4 main buckets of communications. You have paid, earned, social, and owned. And I'm gonna go through each bucket talking about tips and tricks. But again, as I go through this path, in the back of your mind, think about other advocacy things that you want to do with the first 4 buckets I talked about and how you could actually amplify it within these 4 communications realms. Okay, paid media. This is, you know, back in the day, I would say, they had full page ads in the New York Times, full page ads in print papers. And that has really turned into more of a digital presence, right? So now people can buy a full page banner on a national outlet's website and they can talk about a specific issue. It has also really moved into social media platforms and paying for advertising. So one of the things, and I'll get into this a little bit more when we talk about social media, but a lot of people find and read their news now through social media. It's not always through traditional media. So yes, there will be a story or a link that is the original news source, but it's posted on social media. That's how people are engaging with the issue. That's how they are learning about something and figuring out what a collective action could be. So when you talk about paid advertising through social media platforms, the way that they have worked their algorithms now, if you want one of your posts to really show up at the top of people's feeds, they encourage essentially to put some money behind that post, whether it's a daily campaign, weekly campaign, monthly campaign. And what that does is, again, it pushes it to the top of your specific audience's newsfeed, but it also allows you to target specific demographics for your ad, right? So say you want to focus on 40-year-old women who play the piano for whatever issue, right? You can target an ad specifically to them for that. The interesting thing when you talk about paid media is that when you do so, it's important to look at the analytics on the back end. And what those things do is it allows you to see is your message really gaining attention? Is it are people interacting with it with likes and comments? And it also allows you to see impressions. And so what impressions are is essentially how many people could have possibly seen that post. So say there is, let's say the Sierra Club puts out a post and I like it on Facebook. Well, because I took the action of liking it, my audience then could potentially see it in their feed. So that's what it means by impressions. It's the amount of people that could have possibly seen your specific post. Okay, moving into social, since we're kind of on that theme. You know, I mentioned before that this is where people get a lot of their news, and that is very true. I think that you really have to have an eye, again, whenever you're dealing with earned media, which we'll talk about in a second, think about, am I making sure that this information is being broadcasted on my social media platforms? The key thing I would say, and I've noticed this a little bit, is that folks do not always have a consistent message across platforms, and that is actually something very, very important. A lot of times what you can do to make sure that you stay consistent with your message and your talking points is to just have a messaging document, right? Think through, what are the things I want people to actually be thinking about? What is it that I want people to take away from this situation or this issue? And making sure that that message is short, concise, and to the point throughout all of your different mediums, and particularly on social media, making sure that it's short and concise as possible. Attention spans are, you know, kind of short. So the more concise that you can make it, the better. When you're talking about things that do well on social media, you got to think about your own feed, right? When you're scrolling through, what do you focus on? You focus on pictures and you focus on videos. Very rarely will you read a post that's essentially a book-long, you know, paragraph. So when you're developing your post, keep that in mind and make sure that you're implementing those tips and tricks throughout all of your platforms. Okay. The other bucket I want to talk about is owned media. And it is what it sounds like. It is platforms that you specifically own. A lot of times people discount this bucket of communications, but it is extremely important. And the reason I say that is because these platforms, such as your website or a blog or Medium blogs, one of those kinds of sites, it allows for your message to be out there unfiltered, right? You do not have to have your message filtered through a reporter or filtered through something being misunderstood through social media. It is something where your message can stand on its own in its entirety, again, unfiltered. So when I talk about websites, I do think it's really important to make things user-friendly. Now, especially with COVID going on, you know, people's first impressions are websites, right? They look at how easy is it to navigate, how interactive is it, how clear-cut and understandable is the content. So spending a lot of time and investing energy in making sure that a website is the best that it can be is extremely important. And again, thinking of ways that you can have your message out there unfiltered. Okay, the last bucket is earned media, and earned media is the biggest bucket. So I'm gonna take a little bit of time on this. I'm gonna frame it to give you a little bit of an idea of what it is, and then I want to go into some of the tips and tricks within it. So to give you an idea of earned media, it is what it sounds like. You are earning that placement in media. So for example, you are earning or working with a reporter to get a quote from your boss or your organization or your company in a story, right? You are working to get them to cover a press event or a virtual press conference so that there's more awareness. You are putting in a lot of work on the front end to have the result of a quote, a story, awareness. So that's what it means by earned media. Within that, there are a couple different levels of reporters. So you have national reporters, you have state focused reporters, and then trade reporters. Within the national side of things, you know, that's kind of like your New York Times, Washington Post, USA Today. You then have your state and local papers like the Virginian Pilot or Richmond Times Dispatch. And then you have your trade organizations and trade outlets, which sometimes are kind of like organizations, I would say, because they are so focused on a particular issue. They are really, honestly, policy wonks about a particular topic, and they write about it. So like, for example, in the environmental space, there's an outlet that's called Energy and Environment News, and all they cover are energy and environment issues. That's it. And so when you're engaging with reporters in that world, I would say that, you know, sometimes they will know the policy better than you do, right? or just as well as you do. So just keep that in mind when we're going to get into pitching reporters in a little bit, but it's important just to realize there are a bunch of different reporters out there. They focus on different things, and they have different beats or topics that they focus on within those buckets I've discussed. So the other three buckets within earned media is the types of media. So the big three, I would say, are radio, TV, and print. Now, a lot of folks think that radio is not as important now, that people don't listen to it. But the fact of the matter is that they do listen, right? And if you bring in the idea of podcasts, which honestly are essentially radio shows, it's important. They have a very specific following. They have people that are loyal listeners. Being able to make sure that you have that medium and your message in that sphere of things is very important. TV reporters. So the one thing, and I'll get into this a little bit with pitching down the road, but with TV, the biggest thing you have to remember is that they usually have two big meetings in their day. And that's usually their morning meeting and their afternoon meeting. And the reason I say this is if you're trying to get their attention for an event or a topic or an issue, making sure you have your advisory, which is essentially just the who, what, where, when, and why of your event, into them the night before is really important, because what they do in that morning meeting is they go through all the advisories, all the people that have pitched them, or things that are popping up in the news, and they say, okay, how much time do we have today to cover these things? Who do we have that is interested in this and will be able to cover it? And then they schedule out the day, and they allot enough time for that crew and that reporter to then be able to go back and edit it and get it ready for final production. So when you're talking about TV, it is a very important thing to do, but you got to make sure, particularly when you're talking about those local stations, knowing when their morning and their afternoon meetings are. A lot of times, I would say it depends on the station, but it's usually around like 8 a.m., 9 a.m. Honestly, the easiest thing to do is just to call the station and be like, hey, when is your morning meeting? I want to make sure that I get this information to you in a timely fashion. And they, again, do the same process in their afternoon meeting as well. Okay. Print reporters. So I talked about this a little bit when I was discussing like the national, state, and trade side of things. But with print reporters, you really just need to make sure that your pitch is as clean cut and to the point as possible, because they really, you know, they have a lot of people reaching out, right? And when you're pitching a reporter, again, this really could work for both TV, print, and radio. When you're talking about pitching, you are essentially giving your elevator speech of why they should care about your topic, right? You want to make sure that within the first 3 sentences of your email that you explain who you are, why you're reaching out to them, and why it's relevant to them specifically. Why would they spend time essentially reading your email and then following up to include it in a story, okay? So I think it's just important to remember that, to do the work ahead of time of figuring out things that they've covered before, making sure that that's still the beat that they're covering. And if you have further background of a story or an event that you want them to cover, you can put it lower in the email, but make sure that those first 3 sentences are short, sweet, to the point, and make it relevant to them. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about things that create news, right? So one of the things that I do in my job is I look at news clips. That's usually one of the first things I do in the morning. And what that sounds like is what it is, right? It's a clipping of the main big stories of that day. So what it typically includes are all the national outlets, local outlets, and I see, okay, what's driving the news? And what I mean by that is what issue and what topic has been in the news repeatedly. And the important part about when you're looking at clips is seeing how different outlets are covering something, right? So for example, the Wall Street Journal, they're very focused on business and how things impact the economy. So when you're talking about a specific topic, they're going to have that lens in their reporting and how they talk about things. It might be different than how the New York Times discusses things, or different than how the USA Today does. But it's important for you to be able to understand what is driving the news, and then think about, how can I take what's in the news already and use it as an opportunity to implement or to advance a particular issue, topic, agenda that your company has, that your nonprofit has, that your elected official has. It's just important to think of, where can I fit that in, right? And some of the things that you can do to fit it in are things like press conferences, right? Now it's a lot of virtual press conferences because of COVID, but you still get the point across, right? I want to talk about, if you are developing a press conference, what some really good tips and tricks are within that. So the idea here is that you want to keep the speaker list pretty short, right? I would say anywhere from 3 to 5 people. And within those 3 to 5 people, you really need to have at least one of these. So hopefully an elected official, right? It brings in a press hook. It gains the attention of reporters because they are in a position to directly make change in laws and policies. So if you can have one, great, but if not, that's okay too. It's important to have something like a stakeholder or someone who works in direct service on a particular issue because they're the expert, right? Someone from a think tank, something like that. Making sure that you have someone who really understands this issue and has been working on it for years, because when you go to the question and answer part of a press conference, a lot of times they will be able to answer it because they're the expert, right? And the last kind of person that I would recommend having in a press conference is someone who can give a personal narrative about an issue, right? Statistics, yes, they are important to talk about in remarks. Talking about the issue is important, but when you have a personal narrative, when you're able to humanize an issue, it really allows people to connect. People listen to stories, they understand that, they connect with it, and they will listen more. So I would just, again, recommend having those kinds of folks in a press conference, making sure that you have a diverse amount of voices and intersectional voices is really, really important, because you're able to see the topic from a lot of different ways, and you're allowed to see the real breadth and depth of a problem, and again, trying to find what those solutions are. Okay, the other kind of thing that tends to make news, I talked about this a little bit with the collective action of letters. Well, I really want to dive into that because it is really important to look at the power of it. Because you think about, if every governor in the country wrote congressional leadership about a particular issue, that brings attention. You know, look at, I think it was either yesterday or earlier, the, I think it's the Players Coalition, like the NFL, MLB, NBA, they wrote a letter to Congress about the importance of removing qualified immunity. And I think that, you know, that gains attention. When there's a large group of people that are interested in one thing, it allows people to see the breadth and depth of support or opposition for a particular topic. So again, think about that and think about ways you can do that within your own sphere. You know, with Batten, if you get every undergraduate to write about a letter or about an issue in a letter, or you get everyone to call in to their elected official about a particular topic, that is a lot of strength and power in action. So just think about that. The other thing that tends to make news are op-eds. They're also called opinion editorials. And essentially what that is you're explaining your views on something in a newspaper. And there are a couple of tips and tricks that I tend to go through when I'm writing one that hopefully will help you. And essentially what it is you want people to understand what's the problem, why should I care about it, and what can I do about it? Those are the main things. And when you're writing, understand that the first 3 to 4 sentences are the most important part of an op-ed, because that's your press hook. Your goal is to get people to stop and read your op-ed. And if you don't catch them right away at the beginning, people will lose interest, right? They will not have the attention span that you want for them to read all the way through. So making sure your press hook at the top is really important, making sure it's clear and to the point. And, again, your goal is for them to read all the way through, but if they don't, right, think about the way you structure your op-ed so that people read at least the first or second paragraph, and then they have down at the very end a specific call to action or a resolution or something they can take away with it so that they can do something about it. Okay. The last bit of communications that I want to discuss, this is a pretty big topic. It could be a whole nother one of these conversations, but I'm going to try and give you a little bit of the top lines, and that's crisis communications. So a lot of times people do not prepare for crises. They just don't, right? And that's when a lot of mistakes tend to happen. Things can be said that can't be taken back. And it's just important to prepare for something like that. And the best thing I would say is to have what's called a crisis communications plan. And essentially what this is a roadmap for you to navigate a problem when it comes up. And a couple of the key things that are usually in crisis communications plans are an extremely clear chain of command, right? You need to figure out before a problem happens, who is in the decision-making room and who is going to be the final sign-off on things. Having that in your plan, and not only who, but just having their email and their phone number right next to it is really important, because the first thing that happens when a problem arises, you need to get everyone in that chain of command on a call, okay? You need to figure out all the information you possibly have. Think about different issues and ways things can be interpreted. And again, this is another reason it's important to have diversity and intersectionality when you're talking about problems. In general, of course, you need to have diversity and intersectionality, but particularly when you have crises like this, you need to understand how different people will interpret different things, and to understand how to really handle a situation holistically and with the best intent. Okay, a couple of other things with crisis communications. Holding statements. So what this is essentially, a lot of times people before would say something like no comment when a problem would arise. That is not really good to do nowadays, because when you say no comment, it essentially makes the person think like, oh, are they hiding something? Or, what's going on here? So when you have a holding statement, it's a little bit longer, obviously, than a no comment. And what it does is it doesn't usually interject any new information into a problem, but it assures people that you are looking into it and taking it seriously. So for example, it could be something like, this has been brought to our attention, we are looking at it and understanding the issue before we make a decision on ABC. So the important thing is to have those drafts in your plan so that when a problem arises, you can of course adjust it for the particular issue, but you have something you're starting with, and it just makes it a little bit easier. The other thing I would say is to have what's called third-party verifiers. So these are people that can speak on your behalf during a crisis or a problem. What it does essentially is it allows people to see the breadth and depth of your work on this issue beforehand. It allows people to see that there's someone out there that is supportive of you and understands the bigger issue. So that can be anyone from an elected official to an academic to, you know, a stakeholder organization. But it's important to have that conversation with people ahead of time, so that when a crisis does pop up, they're already aware that you're going to need to rely on them to speak on your behalf. So it's just important to think through that, who that would be, have those conversations ahead of time so that you can, you know, call on them when you are in need. Okay. The last part of it, I would say, is communication within your own organization, whether that's a company, whether that's an elected official, whether that's a nonprofit. Yes, in a crisis, you are communicating to the public, but you essentially need to take care of your own house first, right? You need to make sure that people within your organization understand what is happening. They need to understand the issue and what you're doing about it. So making sure that you're talking to folks. If you put anything in writing, I always use the Washington Post test. Anything you put in writing could end up on the front page of the Washington Post. So, because people can leak things, right? And so just make sure that when you're doing that, you keep that in mind. Okay. Those are all of the main things I wanted to talk about, but in closing, I do want to talk again about this personal mission and advocacy and finding your path, and also the importance of self-care. So I think first I want to talk about, making sure that people spend time to really think about what you are passionate about and what the world's need is. It is really, really important to do that. And I'll give myself as an example, right? A lot of times people are unclear what they're passionate about, but when you make it personal, it allows you to think about it in a different way. So for example, my parents are interracial. They were married not long after Loving versus Virginia. They were Air Force officers when they met, and they had to go through a lot just to be with each other. They've been married 41 years now. And they've had a beautiful marriage, but they've gone through so much in regards to people not being accepting of an interracial marriage. And I think that really framed my mind about the importance of equality and justice. I think about my mom, who was a leader as an Air Force officer when that was a time many women were not. I think of my dad, who was is a North Carolina A&T graduate, and was very active in the civil rights movement. And, with sit-ins and protests and organizing and advocacy. I think of my grandma, who was an educator in Charleston, South Carolina during segregation. And I think about all of these things, and I realize that social justice issues, for me, is very important. It's the river that everything runs through for me. So if I see a policy issue that has an inequity, for me, I'm interested in it because I want to make sure that everyone has a fair shot. Everyone has a fair shot at equality and justice. And so I say these things because sometimes folks are like, well, I don't have one policy issue that I'm really interested in. But, you can be interested in an umbrella issue of equality. You can be interested in an umbrella issue of fairness and justice, and finding ways within different policy issues to be able to try and help fix it, right? The other part I want to talk about is self-care. Now, this sounds like a buzzword that people say a lot, but I've had so many conversations with folks recently with everything going on with COVID and everything going on with this issue of systemic racism bubbling up to our collective awareness. You have to make sure to take care of yourself. Finding things that bring you joy and scheduling out time every single day to do it, just like you schedule time for a coffee or a meeting or work. Make sure that you're scheduling time for yourself, because the reason I say that is when you're talking about advocacy, when you're talking about changing the world, it is very difficult, and you have to be able to sustain it. And by doing the time and investment in self-care, you'll be able to help other people and to reach, the end goal of your mission. So again, I just really encourage folks to spend time thinking about what drives you, your passion, the world's need, and making sure that you're taking time and self-care to be able to do those things. So that's all that I have. I think we're going to take some questions, and I'll kick it back over to Jill.
Thank you so much, Irma, for that incredibly thoughtful and robust presentation. We are recording it, so for those of you who weren't taking copious notes, you can go back and review it. There's a lot of information there. We're really appreciative. If someone has a question, I'd be happy to take it. You can either pose it in the chat, or yes, if you want to raise your hand, I may or may not see you since we have so many people, but you could try that too. I'll start, Irma, while we're waiting for someone to raise a question. You talked a lot about amplifying your message. I was wondering, particularly working in the political arena, if there are times when you need to worry about maybe scaling back the message that you really would like to send, and just sort of the tensions that exist depending on whether you're in the nonprofit or the political or even the private sector, sort of how you have to think about the impact of your communication depending on the sector in which you're working.
Absolutely. I mean, that is a very good question, and it's really important. It's important to think about it in the frame of proactive versus reactive messaging, right? Sometimes you want to proactively get out there and push your message, and sometimes things happen and you may not want to comment right away. You may not know all the information that's happening, and sometimes issues can be rapidly changing. So sometimes it is important just to take a beat and think about it, get all the information that you can, and really talk with folks about what you should be doing in that space. And again, I think this is another reason that it's important to have diversity and inclusion when you're talking about messaging, because everyone has a different experience. And when you're able to understand an issue from multiple lenses, it really helps you. One, it helps you have a really good response, but it also helps you to understand things that you don't know, right? You don't know what you don't know. And when you have a collective group of people talking about a problem and really figuring out what's the best way to go about it, really makes it holistically a better response.
All right, I have another question. I'm waiting for questions here. I think people are being shy today. Looking for hands. I have another question. That is, I think sometimes our policy students, or even some of our policy graduates, I see Kate has a question. I'll go ahead and I'll finish mine, and then we'll get to the questions. Sometimes they don't realize it's sort of a slow evolution where they realize that they are interested in a communications career using their policy degree. And I was curious, what would be sort of some triggers for people to maybe have the light bulb go off in their head that this might be a field they'd like to work in?
Well, I think that one of the things I really enjoy about communications is, and one of the reasons I really loved going to Batten for a policy degree is I am now able to understand the policy and the nuts and bolts about something, and then I am able to bring it to a point where other people can understand it, right? Because there is an importance in having communication equality, right? If people don't know about an issue, if they don't understand it, how are they going to be able to engage within it? So if a policy student is interested in making sure people are collectively working on a policy issue, or if they really enjoy writing and making things really clear and concise, which I know is something really important in Batten memos, think about communications. It is another part of policy, and it's a little bit different, right? But it is within the realm. And so I think it's just something for folks to think about if they enjoy writing, if they enjoy talking about issues, maybe communications is for them.
Thank you. Okay, we've got some questions. We have some of the names you might even recognize as former classmates. From Kate Bondurant, can you share with us your creative process when writing a speech, and where do you gather inspiration? Coming from an alum who has also worked in the communications field.
Yeah, well, so good to see you. And thank you for your question. I a lot of times, you know, with my current boss, we are very similar, right? We both, you know, are focused on equality and justice and really care about people. And so in a way that makes my job a lot easier because we think of things very similarly. And I would say that when I think about speech writing, I do it in phases, right? And I give myself the time and space to really go through that process. Now, sometimes I don't have the time to do it. It's a more rapid pace of this process because sometimes we'll need speeches out of the blue. But that happens, that's the nature of it. But what I do first is I do research and information gathering. That's really my first step. If I am familiar with the topic, it's a little bit easier, but if I'm not, I talk to our policy staff. I talk to, you know, other communications team members and think about what is this issue? What are the problems within it? And how can I explain it to people in a way that connects with them on a human level? So a lot of times what I will do is I spend that time researching and information gathering, and then I will usually do an outline that, you know, flows logically. But then what I do is I free write. I literally just, it comes, you know, into my head and it goes out on the paper. And it is messy and it doesn't make sense half the time. But it allows me just to have that free-flowing brainstorm of writing. And then once I do that, then I go back and essentially make it coherent. I go back through and figure out how can I crystallize this message and make it clear and to the point. But one of the things that is really important is that people feel that you see them and understand that you see them. You see their pain, you see what they're going through, and have a very specific action that you're taking to help them. So that's kind of my, I would say, light that guides me when I'm speech writing. But it definitely is a process, that is for sure.
All right, our next question is from another board member, Asazi Francois. Can you explain the nuances between writing material for a political campaign versus a policy or legislative initiative?
Well, we do have to keep campaign things completely separate than official business. So that is, it's a different mindset, right? You do a lot of the same things I talked about with the speech writing process, but your goals are a little bit different, right? When it comes to campaigns, you want to be able to make people understand your candidate and things that are not the best in the other candidate. And so it's a little bit different of a focus, but the overall process is pretty much the same, I would say.
Okay, we have a really timely question from Megan Clancy, who's one of our current students. Okay. How do you balance being concise but informative in your messaging, particularly with ideas that are relatively new to the public? And she says that she's thinking specifically about the language that has been used with respect to the defund the police movement, which gave a lot of people a negative reaction to the word defund, and they didn't necessarily fully engage with the messaging to understand what it actually meant. It's a great question, Megan.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing you have to realize is that, you know, a lot of communications is sound bites, right? And hashtags and really short snippets of things. And it is a balance that you have to strike of informing people and keeping things concise. But I think if you are to have something that is a very, you know, a slogan or a saying, following it up with a sentence of what I mean by this is, essentially, right? You want to explain. So you have your slogan or your main phrase, but then you can have a sentence right after that saying, this means X, Y, and Z. And, you know, I think one way that helps me with explaining difficult issues and keeping it concise, I actually go back to the idea of an elevator pitch. So think about in an elevator, if you're trying to talk to somebody, you maybe have 30 seconds to a minute. And sometimes what I will do is talk out loud what my argument is and time it, 30 seconds to a minute. And that allows me to just get out, what exactly am I trying to say? And one of the things that, with messaging, you can have background information, right? So like your main messaging needs to be short and concise, but you can also give people background information that goes a little bit more into depth about what it is. So you kind of get the best of keeping it concise, but also giving enough information for people to understand it.
The next question, we actually received two similar ones, one from an alum and one in a private chat. What are the strategies that you find successful for addressing audiences who disagree with your point of view?
Yeah, well, I think it's actually really important to do. I think one of the things when you're writing is you have to think of what could someone possibly say against this? And the importance of acknowledging someone's different viewpoint, but then responding to it and explaining your side. I think that is something that's really important with messaging. Thinking of how could someone potentially criticize this? And how can I, before it even goes out there, acknowledge and respond to an opposing view?
Okay, the next question is, how do you create broad support? This is from an alum also. How do you create broad support for an issue that might affect a very specific group or demographic, particularly when the relevancy to your audience might not be immediate or obvious?
It's a really great question. I think the biggest thing I would do is focus on the human nature of issues, right? And our collective humanity. When you're able to bring things down to a personal level, when you're able to show someone's personal story and that we're all human beings, it allows people to understand things. So, for example, within the environmental movement, a lot of people, of course, are interested in national parks and, making sure that the issue of climate change is addressed. But those seem like really big topics. When you drill down into the issue, for example, of environmental justice, there is a common idea and belief, rightfully so, that everyone should have access to clean water, they should have clean air to breathe, and safe land to be on. So when you think about it in that way, on a very human, personal level, it allows people to see the human impact of things, and it allows them to see that they might be able to connect with an issue in a way that they may not have before.
Okay, our next question you sort of touched on, but just in case you want to add something to it, this is a question from a former Kamala 2020 campaign staffer. How do your communication goals change between campaigning and governing? And like I said, you did touch on that a little bit, but I wondered if there was anything more specific you wanted to add.
As I said before, like you do have to kind of keep campaign things and official things separate. But I think the important thing to remember is that when you're talking about issues that an elected official campaigned about, a lot of it is the same, right? They got into public office and public service because they're focused on helping things be better. And a lot of those topics are still the same. And it's a matter of then, once you are in elected office, to be able to enact them. So a lot of the issues are still the same. A lot of the positions are still the same. And now you're in a role that you can actually enact change. So some of the language will just change to, yes, this issue is important, and here's what I am specifically doing about it. This is the legislation I am introducing, or this is the coalition I'm bringing together, those kinds of things.
We have a question from a current student. Can you speak to the difference between getting a message out through the media versus directly to your own followers and constituents, whether social media, email, and whether there is one that is preferable, and again, the framing between the different messages?
Yeah, so I actually think it's important to look at the buckets I discussed with the paid, earned, owned, and social, and making sure that you're touching each side of those buckets, right? So like when you think about communications, it's not something where oh, I am only going to do social media and that is it. Like, that's not going to be something where your message is getting out as far and wide as it could be. So it's important to be able to think of when you have an overall strategy and an issue you want to go out there, making sure that you keep each of those buckets in mind and what you specifically are doing within each of those. And, you know, with whichever team you're in, you can have one person focusing on each of those buckets. And then when you have a brainstorm, you know, you can talk about how the overall strategy is in sync.
All right, we're getting lots of questions still, and some are private and some are, so I'm trying to kind of condense a little bit. And I'm wondering if we could even potentially give them an email address to share potentially or a way to, if they want to send questions to me, I could send them to you. And but before we get to that, I'm trying to kind of condense. There's one this one's really important, I think. How, if you're part of an organization that is not particularly, let me find how they said it. What's the best way to advocate for more support for diversity and inclusion if you're part of an organization that is currently not very diverse, and recognizing that the makeup of an organization can't change overnight?
I think it's such an important question to ask. And even being able to talk about that topic is really important and something that hasn't always happened. So first, I think it's important that that issue and that topic is coming to the surface to begin with. When you're in organizations that are not diverse, I think it is important to be able to talk about why diversity is important. And not just diversity, but diversity and inclusion, right? You want to make sure that people are really being heard and understood when they're talking about a particular issue. I think it's important sometimes to pull people aside for a one-on-one with leadership and explain to them the problem that you're seeing and why it's important to have a lot of different people looking at a topic or working in an office, because it allows for honestly, the beauty and diversity to come into reality. When you have different people with different mindsets and experiences, it really allows for an understanding, and it allows for people to come to collective action and find solutions and results in a much more holistic way. So when you're talking to leadership, you know, explain to them the technical importance of diversity, and then also the importance to you as a specific staffer if you are someone, you know, who is diverse. And if you're not someone who is, you know, has a diverse background, that's important too, to advocate for diversity. This is something where everyone can say something and do something to make things better. So again, talking about the technical importance, right? Having a good end product, having a holistic view of issues and problems, but then also what it means to you personally. Because again, the importance of humanizing an issue is really, really important. I hope that helps.
It does. I've got a couple questions about your own career path.
Sure.
Basically, how have your different positions helped shape your view of communication strategies? And then another question is, what's next for you?
I'm getting that a lot lately.
I mean, we can all wonder, can't we?
I will say with my path, you know, for me, I have always focused on the issue of social justice, and I have tried not to tie my mission or my goal to one organization or one company or one person, but to that overall mission. And that has really allowed me to guide where I go, right? Which offices that I am working with and people I am working with, because that is my first goal. And if I'm able to work in a place that allows me to reach that goal, that's good, right? So I would say when you're looking at what you want your path to be, go back again to that focus on what your passion is and the world's need, and let that guide you to where you can be. You know, you can really affect change from a lot of different places. The public sector, within that, you have federal, state, and local. You have executive, judiciary, legislative. You have the nonprofit side of things. You have companies. You have like the corporate social responsibility side of companies. You know, you have academia. You know, it's important to realize that there's so many ways that you can impact change, and allow yourself the space to be able to navigate what that looks like in your career. You know, with communications in particular, you know, I have a federal background, state background, and private sector. And I think what that allowed me to do is to see how communication is slightly different in each of those sectors, but you can still work on the issues that are really important to you wherever you might go. Oh, and the what's next thing. Again, I've been asked that a lot lately, but I will say this, I try to keep an open mind of where careers go. And I know that, you know, my guiding light path is social justice issues. So whatever it might be, I know that I'll be working on social justice. So that's good in my book.
Spoken like a very good person who works in the political arena. I was trying to write White House, but I thought that might be a little presumptuous. So, Irma, we are so appreciative of your time today. Like I said, we have lots of other questions, so I'm going to take a picture of them and maybe send them to you. But we just could not be more appreciative. Like I said, when we first connected, I know that you are really, really busy now and overwhelmed and exhausted. And so it really is really a testament to your spirit of public service and to the dedication you've shown the Batten School, both as a student and as an alum, to be with us today. And we are extremely, extremely appreciative.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for having me here today. And I, again, am happy to help people with finding their path. So I'm looking forward to answering some more of those questions. Thank you.
And thanks to the rest of our community. It's good to see your faces, and I hope you get some rest the rest of the day and have a good day.